The moment Hugo blocked my path, I knew something was wrong. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The soft hum of music drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of fresh flowers. My father stood beside me, adjusting his tie nervously, while my bridesmaids whispered behind me, fluffing my veil. Lucas, my soon-to-be husband, waited at the altar with a hopeful smile. Everything was perfect until Hugo stepped in front of me. He wasn't barking, he wasn't wagging his tail, he just stood there staring at me with those deep amber eyes, full of something I couldn't quite place, pleading, urgent, desperate. "Hugo, come on, buddy," I whispered, trying to step around him, but he wouldn't move. His weight leaned into me, his head pressing against my gown. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Welcome to today's story. Let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time you're tuning in. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to support the channel. Watch until the end to see how this incredible story unfolds. Let's dive in. My father reached for Hugo's leash, but the low rumble of a growl stopped him in his tracks. Hugo never growled, not at me, not at anyone. A chill ran down my spine. I crouched down, gathering the layers of my dress around me, and cupped his face in my hands. His fur was warm, but his body trembled slightly beneath my touch. "What's wrong, boy?" My fingers ran over his graying muzzle, my heart pounding as I noticed the way his chest rose and fell, too shallow, too fast. "Grace," my mother called, her voice tinged with impatience. "We're running out of time." But time suddenly felt like the least of my worries. I wasn't thinking about the wedding, the guests, or the beautifully decorated venue waiting for me just beyond the doors. My entire world had narrowed to the dog who had been by my side through every joy and every heartbreak. I leaned in, pressing my forehead to his. "I'm here, Hugo," I whispered. "I'm not leaving you." His body sagged against me in response. The murmurs from the crowd turned to confused whispers, but I didn't hear them. My fingers traced the lines of his face, memorizing every inch of him. My Hugo, my best friend. Lucas stepped forward, concern shadowing his blue eyes. "Grace, what's going on?" I looked up at him, then back at Hugo. The lump in my throat tightened. "Something's wrong," I said, my voice barely more than a breath. My father crouched beside me. "Grace, we can't wait much longer. The ceremony, the wedding can wait." The words left my lips before I even realized I'd spoken them. I straightened, holding Hugo steady. "We need to get him to the vet, now." A sharp gasp came from my mother, but I didn't turn to look. My father opened his mouth, but before he could protest, Lucas spoke. "You don't need to apologize." His voice was steady, sure. "Hugo comes first." Relief surged through me. In that moment I knew, without hesitation, that I was marrying the right man. Still dressed in my wedding gown, I gathered my skirts and led Hugo toward my car. The guests parted in stunned silence. Lucas followed, phone in hand, already calling the emergency vet. My father hurried behind us, speaking quietly to the minister. The wedding was put on hold, but I didn't care. My heart pounded with urgency as Hugo leaned against me, his breaths coming in shallow puffs. The ride to the vet was a blur. I cradled Hugo's head in my lap, his fur warm beneath my fingers, his trust in me unwavering. "I should have known," I murmured, pressing a kiss to his head. "He's been acting different all week. I thought it was just the wedding stress, but..." Lucas glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his jaw tight. "You couldn't have known, Grace. What matters is that we're here now." The clinic's warm lights shone like a beacon against the darkening sky. Dr. Peterson, Hugo's longtime vet, was already waiting at the door. We rushed inside, and I carried Hugo to the exam table, my dress trailing behind me, forgotten. Minutes stretched into eternity as the vet worked. My hands never left Hugo's fur. Lucas stood beside me, his arm wrapped around my shoulders. My heart pounded as I watched Dr. Peterson's expression shift, calm, careful, then sorrowful. "Hugo is in advanced heart failure," he said gently, his voice carrying the weight of finality. The stress of the day worsened his symptoms. Medication can keep him comfortable, but I didn't need him to finish. The room spun around me. Hugo had stopped me from walking down the aisle, not because he was scared, not because he was anxious, but because he was asking for help. Tears welled in my eyes as I leaned over him, pressing my forehead to his once more. "I'm so sorry, buddy," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." Lucas's hand tightened around mine. "What's the next step, Doc?" he asked, ever the steady presence beside me. Dr. Peterson explained the treatment plan, but his words barely reached me. All I could do was stroke Hugo's fur, memorize the rhythm of his breaths, hold on to the time we had left, and then the clinic door opened. "Grace?" My father's voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. I turned to find him standing there, my mother at his side, tears in her eyes. Sophie, my maid of honor, held her phone in her hands, her expression full of quiet determination. Behind them, the minister stepped forward. "We thought you might need some support," my father said simply. Sophie smiled through her tears. "The guests understand, but maybe we don't have to cancel the wedding." The minister nodded kindly. "If you're willing, we can hold the ceremony here, with Hugo by your side." Emotions surged in my chest. I turned to Lucas, searching his face for any hesitation. There was none. "It's not the wedding we planned," he murmured, his eyes warm with understanding. "But it feels right." I let out a shaky, tearful laugh, gripping his hand. "Let's do it." An hour later, in the quiet of the clinic, we said our vows. My dress was wrinkled, my makeup streaked with tears, but none of that mattered. Hugo lay at our feet, his tail giving the faintest wag as if he understood. As the minister pronounced us husband and wife, a soft woof escaped Hugo's lips, a sound full of love, full of meaning. The perfect wedding wasn't the one I had imagined. It was the one where I learned the truest meaning of love. And Hugo, my best friend, had taught me that all along. The drive home from the clinic was quiet. Lucas kept one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally reaching back to stroke Hugo's fur. I sat in the back seat with him, my wedding dress now crumpled and stained with tears. Hugo rested his head in my lap, his breathing slow and uneven. "You okay?" Lucas asked softly, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I swallowed hard, brushing my fingers through Hugo's fur. "No," I admitted, "but I will be." I wanted to believe that. We had postponed the reception. There would be no grand entrance, no first dance, no celebration under twinkling lights. None of it mattered now. The only thing that mattered was Hugo, his comfort, his final days, however many we had left. When we pulled into the driveway, Lucas helped me lift Hugo from the car. He was heavier than I remembered, or maybe I was just more aware of how fragile he was now. He leaned against me as we walked inside, his paws dragging slightly against the hardwood floor. The house was still decorated for the wedding. White roses sat in vases on the dining table. Candles flickered softly along the shelves. It felt surreal, like stepping into a life that no longer existed. Lucas set up a bed in the living room, layering blankets and pillows to make Hugo as comfortable as possible. I knelt beside him, my fingers stroking his graying muzzle. He sighed contentedly, resting his head against my leg. For a moment, it felt like any other evening we had spent together. But this time, an invisible clock ticked in the background, reminding me that nothing was the same. "I wish we had more time," I whispered. Lucas sat beside me, his arm brushing against mine. "We'll make the most of what we have." I looked at him then, really looked at him. He had been incredible through all of this, never questioning, never hesitating, just supporting me in every way possible. I reached for his hand, threading my fingers through his. "Thank you," I whispered. "You don't have to thank me," he said, squeezing my hand. "Hugo's family." That night, we didn't sleep in our bedroom. Instead, we camped out in the living room, lying beside Hugo, our hands resting on his fur as he drifted in and out of sleep. Every time his breathing hitched, my heart clenched. Every time he shifted, I held my breath, terrified that it might be the last time. In the quiet darkness, I let myself remember. I remembered the first time I saw Hugo at the shelter, a scrawny pup with two big paws, staring at me with cautious curiosity. I hadn't planned to adopt a dog that day, but the moment our eyes met, I knew. I remembered the stormy night when he was still small, trembling beneath my bed. I had pulled him into my arms, whispering that I would always keep him safe. I remembered the time he sat beside me after my first heartbreak, his head resting on my knee as I sobbed into my hands. He had stayed with me for hours, silent and steady, his quiet presence more comforting than any words could have been. I remembered him racing ahead of me in the park the day I met Lucas, barking playfully as if he knew something I didn't. And maybe he had. He had been there for my entire adult life, every step, every milestone, every moment. And now I had to be there for him. The next morning, Hugo barely lifted his head. His tail thumped once against the blankets, weak but full of trust. I forced a smile, running my fingers over his ears. "Hey, buddy," I whispered. "I'm here." Lucas knelt beside me, his eyes filled with quiet sorrow. We both knew. By noon, I had made the call to Dr. Peterson. I spent the rest of the afternoon by Hugo's side, whispering stories to him, telling him everything I had never said aloud. How much I loved him, how grateful I was, how I wished I could freeze time and hold on just a little longer. That evening, we drove back to the clinic. The car ride was eerily silent. Hugo lay in my lap, just as he had on our way home from the wedding. My fingers never stopped stroking his fur, as if I could somehow memorize the texture, the warmth, the feel of him. Lucas kept one hand on the wheel, the other reaching back to touch Hugo gently. When we arrived, Dr. Peterson was already waiting. The room was warm, filled with soft light. A blanket had been prepared for him, a space where he could rest comfortably. I knelt beside Hugo, pressing my forehead to his. "You were my best friend," I choked out. "The best boy." His breathing slowed. I felt Lucas's presence beside me, steady and warm. His fingers wrapped around mine. Dr. Peterson spoke softly, explaining what would happen, but his words felt distant. All I could do was hold Hugo, feel the warmth of him, try to capture this last moment before it slipped away. And then he was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. I pressed my forehead to his, my body shaking with silent sobs. Lucas wrapped his arms around me, holding me together as I fell apart. That night, the house felt impossibly empty. Hugo's bed sat untouched in the corner. His leash still hung by the door. Every instinct told me to listen for his breathing, to reach out for the comforting weight of him at my feet. But he wasn't there. Lucas and I sat together on the couch, wrapped in a silence that neither of us knew how to break. Eventually, he pulled me close, his breath warm against my hair. "You gave him a good life, Grace," he whispered. "He knew how much you loved him." I swallowed hard, nodding. My voice broke. "I don't know how to do this without him." Lucas didn't answer right away. He simply held me tighter, his presence grounding me. And then after a long moment, he spoke. "You don't have to." I lifted my head, meeting his gaze. He gave me a small, sad smile. "We'll figure it out together." And in that moment, even through the unbearable ache of loss, I knew he was right. Hugo was gone, but love never left. The house felt unbearably quiet. I hadn't realized how much of my life revolved around Hugo until he was gone. Every morning I still reached for his leash by the door before remembering there was no reason to take a walk. I still expected to hear the soft padding of his paws against the floor, the gentle sigh he made before settling in for a nap. But there was only silence. Lucas was patient with me. He didn't push, didn't fill the space with empty reassurances. He just let me grieve. Some nights he held me as I cried into his shoulder. Other times we sat together in quiet understanding, staring at Hugo's empty bed. One afternoon, a week after Hugo was gone, I found myself sitting on the floor beside his bed, tracing the worn fabric with my fingertips. His collar still rested on the shelf above it, the tag glinting in the soft light. Lucas appeared in the doorway, watching me for a moment before stepping forward. "You don't have to get rid of it," he said gently. I swallowed hard, gripping the fabric of the bed. "I don't think I can." He knelt beside me, resting a hand on my knee. "Then don't." I looked up at him, searching his face. "I just feel stuck," I admitted, "like moving forward means leaving him behind." Lucas squeezed my hand. "Loving him doesn't stop just because he's gone, Grace," I nodded, blinking back tears. "I know, but I don't know what to do with all of this." Lucas hesitated before speaking. "Maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now," he said. "Maybe we just take it one day at a time." I exhaled shakily, nodding. "Yeah." A few days later, Lucas brought up the shelter. He had waited until we were sitting in the park, a place that had once been filled with the sound of Hugo's paws running ahead of me. I had avoided coming here since his passing, but something about the crisp autumn air and the way the golden leaves danced around us made me feel like he was still here somehow. Lucas hesitated before speaking. I was thinking maybe we could do something in Hugo's honor. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? Like volunteering at the shelter, he said, or donating, something that keeps his memory alive. The idea settled into my heart like a warm ember, but I shook my head. I don't know if I can, I admitted. Being around other dogs, it's too soon. Lucas didn't push. That's okay, he said simply. But just know, when you're ready, it could be a way to honor him. I nodded but didn't say anything. A week later, I found myself standing at the entrance of the local animal shelter. I wasn't sure why I had come. Lucas hadn't pressured me, and I hadn't made any promises to myself. But something about the empty spaces in my home, in my heart, had led me here. The scent of clean straw and the soft murmur of barking greeted me as I stepped inside. The woman at the front desk smiled warmly. "Can I help you?" I hesitated before answering. "I was hoping to make a donation," I said, "and maybe just look around." Her face lit up. "That's wonderful. We're always happy to have visitors." She led me through the rows of kennels, and my heart ached at the sight of so many hopeful eyes staring back at me. Some dogs wagged their tails eagerly, others watched with quiet wariness. Each one of them was waiting for a home, for love, for someone to choose them. Then, at the very end of the row, I saw him. A senior golden retriever lay curled on a worn blanket, his fur speckled with gray. He lifted his head slightly as I approached, his deep brown eyes calm, knowing. He didn't rush to greet me, didn't bark or beg for attention. He simply watched. I froze. The woman beside me smiled. "That's Lucky," she said. "He's been here for a while. Older dogs tend to get overlooked." I swallowed hard. Lucky. He looked nothing like Hugo, and yet something about him felt familiar. There was a quiet patience in his gaze, a silent understanding that made my chest tighten. I knelt down, reaching out carefully. "Hey, buddy," I whispered. Lucky lifted his head just enough to rest it against my outstretched hand. His fur was warm beneath my fingertips. His eyes fluttered shut as if settling into something safe, something certain. I wasn't sure how long I sat there just feeling. I hadn't come here looking for another dog. I wasn't sure I was ready. But as I knelt there, Lucky resting his head against my palm, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe love wasn't about replacing. Maybe it was about making space for something new. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, my hand resting against Lucky's fur. Something about him reminded me of Hugo, but it wasn't in the way he looked or moved. It was something deeper, a quiet understanding, a steady presence. But loving another dog felt impossible. I had already given my heart away once. Could I do it again? The shelter worker shifted beside me. "Would you like to take him outside for a bit?" I hesitated. "I don't know if I should." She offered a kind smile. "There's no pressure. Just take a little time with him." I nodded, swallowing hard. A few minutes later, we were in the small outdoor play area behind the shelter. Lucky walked slowly, his steps measured and deliberate. He didn't rush, didn't pull. He just stayed by my side, his gaze flicking up to me every few moments. It was as if he was waiting for me to decide. I sat down on one of the benches, exhaling shakily. Lucky settled at my feet without hesitation, curling up as though he had always belonged there. Lucas's voice echoed in my mind. "Loving him doesn't stop just because he's gone." I looked down at Lucky. "I don't know if I'm ready," I admitted. He sighed softly, his tail giving a single, slow wag. I let out a breath, reaching down to run my fingers through his fur. "You don't expect anything from me, do you?" I whispered. Lucky didn't move, just leaned into my touch. And suddenly, I realized something. Love had never been about deserving or timing. Love didn't wait for you to be ready, it simply was. I had been holding on to Hugo with both hands, afraid that letting go meant losing him forever. But maybe, love didn't work that way. Maybe Hugo had never left at all. The car ride home was quiet. Lucas kept glancing at me from the driver's seat, his expression unreadable. Lucky lay in the back, his head resting on my lap. "You sure about this?" Lucas finally asked. I exhaled slowly, my fingers threading through Lucky's fur. "No," I admitted, "but I think that's okay." Lucas smiled. "Yeah, it is." That first night, I expected to feel guilt. I thought bringing Lucky home would feel like a betrayal, like I was replacing Hugo. But it didn't. Lucky didn't try to take Hugo's place. He didn't sleep in the exact same spot, didn't nuzzle into my lap in quite the same way. He was different, and somehow that made it okay. He was just Lucky, not a replacement, not a second choice, just a new kind of love. The weeks passed in a bittersweet mix of healing and remembering. Some days, I still reached for Hugo's leash by mistake. I still caught myself expecting his bark, still thought I saw him in the corner of my eye. But instead of pain, those moments began to bring warmth. Hugo had taught me how to love unconditionally, and now with Lucky, I was learning how to love again. One evening as I sat in the backyard watching the sky fade into deep purples and golds, Lucky curled up beside me.